Samvad, at the Samvad venue of the Jaipur Literature Festival 2019. We're very, very happy to have you here. Thank you so much for your patience. Please, if you have a chair next to you, we're about to start. Please move up. There's no saving of chairs now. These gentlemen here on their phones, excuse me, please move up. So we have so many people wanting chairs. You cannot save any more chairs, please. Move up, please. Yeah. Oh, they're just taking selfies. Okay. All right, enough of the selfies. It's time to kick the session off. Thanks, everybody. So, what I'd love to say is welcome, welcome. We have a session here which we're calling In Search of Miracles, and it's a real honor to have our, well, two authors here. But in particular, we have Markus Zusak, who is our best-selling, masterful storyteller author. But he's in conversation with John Zubrzycki. And this session... So this session is presented by the Australian High Commission. And I would just like to thank them, obviously, for their sponsorship, but also to tell you a quick bit about John Zubrzycki. He has a degree in Indian history, and from his biography, he's clearly a big-time traveler in India and many, many places around the world. He's worked as a diplomat and as a foreign correspondent in New Delhi, and he's written 3 wonderful books on India. Would you please give a very warm welcome to both John and Markus?
Thank you all for coming. What a beautiful day. The sun is out, so we're going to make this a very cheerful session. Markus probably doesn't need very much introduction. I'm sure, hands up who's got a copy of The Book Thief on their bookshelf. Yeah. Hands up who's got a copy of my book. Okay, great. Oh, thank you. All right, we need to say no more. Listen, as we know, Markus's first book, The Book Thief, was on the international bestseller list for 10 years, and then was adapted into a beautiful movie starring Geoffrey Rush, Emily Watson, and Sophie Nélisse that picked up a slew of awards. Recently, he was listed as the 14th. It was listed as the 14th most favorite books in a survey of viewers to the public broadcasting service in America. So it's no exaggeration to say that Markus's new book has been eagerly awaited for 13 years. Bridge of Clay is the story of the Dunbar boys, Matthew, who is the narrator, Rory, Henry, Clayton, and Thomas. Their mother is dead, their father has disappeared. They live a tough life in an old rundown house, a place of arguments, fights, 1980s movies, wayward pets, and a piano that is determinedly never played. It's a sweeping family saga of secrets and stories and how the decisions of those around us shape our own journey. It's beautifully written, poetic in many parts, but also very, very Australian, full of quirky characters and vernacular storytelling. And I think I want to start just by quoting a very short section from early in the beginning of the book. You know, when I say it's so very Australian, if today Melbourne is experiencing load shedding because it's in the it's over 40 degrees. Load shedding is something that is familiar to many Indians, but is certainly not familiar to us in Australia. And this book is set in Western Sydney. And Western Sydney Sydney's a big city. Those who are lucky enough and live on the coast, we get the afternoon sea breezes and it's 30 degrees. Those who live out west bake in the 45-degree heat, which is probably what they're doing today as well. So there's this lovely section very close to the beginning of the book, and it reads like this. Inside, the house was oven-like. The furniture all was roasted. The pictures just out of the toaster. They had an air conditioner. It was broken. There was tea and Scotch fingers, and the sun clapped hard at the window. There was ample sweat at the table. it dripped from arm to cloth. I mean, I read that and I just was absolutely just sucked into the beauty of those words and that lovely pared-back language. I get the feeling, Markus, that you crafted every single word in this 500-page plus book. Every punctuation mark was carefully chosen. You come across not only as a great storyteller, but also as a perfectionist. Would that be true?
Well, before I even answer that, I'm just looking out at everyone here, and I just want to say, I just love you for coming. I love you for not only, and I love you for reading my books, and especially people who are here for the Book Thief. And that book meant everything to me, and Bridge of Clay means everything and almost more. But I know you're here for that book, and thank you so much for everything you've given me. And I also, you do your first talks like this, and no one turns up. So to see you out there, just it's made my whole trip to India. It's not that it hasn't been great, but it's such a highlight to see you all out there, and thank you. Also, a little bit like Fawlty Towers, the old TV show, Don't Mention the War. They say at the moment in Australia, I was going to India, and they said, don't mention the cricket. So I'm mentioning the cricket. Congratulations, India. I'm sitting up here in a lot of pain. A lot of pain. But it was a beautiful thing and beautifully done. So congratulations. And now I can answer the question. Okay. and that is, I'm not going to say it was painful writing Bridge of Clay, but every word, every sentence, every full stop, every comma there is deliberate. And I think one of the great pressures of writing The Book Thief was that I thought no one was going to read that book. I thought this book is going to die the quickest death. It's just going to sink without a trace. Because I imagined someone asking their friends, or someone actually, I thought, what if someone reads it and actually likes it? They're going to try to recommend it to their friend, and their friend says, well, what's it about? And what do? You say, well, it's set in Nazi Germany, it's narrated by death, nearly everyone dies, and it's 580 pages long. You'll love it. So I thought, no one is going to read that book, and this time it was the opposite. This time, the challenge then was, are you going to still write The Book Thief? Are you still capable of putting that effort in for no reward? This time it was the opposite. It was, a lot of people are going to read Bridge of Clay because of The Book Thief. Will you still write it the way it has to be written? And then take whatever criticisms come when people say, yeah, but it's not The Book Thief. And you've got to take a deep breath every day and then say, no, this is what it is. This is how it has to be. And every single word in that book is how I wanted it to be in the end. And I think that's all you can ask of yourself as a writer.
Now, thank you, Markus. You actually, the idea for this book formed in your head, 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. So even before you started writing The Book Thief, you were thinking about this book. But in that time, you've changed. You've gone from, probably single in those days, you're married, you've got 2 kids, 2 dogs, and you've got an incredibly successful book that you've got to follow up. So tell us a little bit about the process of coming up with the idea for Bridge of Clay and how that idea changed over that time.
Yeah, it's quite funny that you said you're probably single. I was very single when I was writing, when I first thought of Bridge of Clay. And I was such a loser. I would walk around my town where I grew up in the southern part of Sydney, and I had really, I felt like I had no friends, and I didn't have a girlfriend. I didn't have any. I felt like George Costanza, walking around my suburb with no prospects or possibility, and I was walking. I would always walk around and I would dream, and then I got this idea about a boy who wanted to build a bridge, and he wanted that bridge to be perfect. Now, every book needs one little piece of luck, or two little pieces of luck that come together. And the little piece of luck that I had, and I can give you the different examples, but the bit of luck I had with The Book Thief was writing with some kids at a school, and I got them to write. I wrote with them, and I used death as the narrator in the story that I wrote. And I thought, oh, I might just put that in that book set in Nazi Germany, and that changed everything. In this case, in the boy who was going to build the bridge, his name was Clayton, and I thought it's going to be called Clayton's Bridge. And then I went 2 months later. I went for another long walk because I had nowhere else to go, nowhere else to be, no one else to be with, and my parents were home. My brother and sisters had moved out, and then I just thought, not Clayton's Bridge. What about Bridge of Clay? And as soon as I heard the word clay, and then just in an instant, a whole new depth of emotion and meaning in the story came to me, because I thought clay, the material of the earth, and Clay, the boy's name. And I thought clay can be molded into anything, but it needs fire to set it. And that's what I saw. I saw a boy who was going to mold his whole life into this bridge, and he was going to wait for the river to flood the bridge. And the whole test to make a perfect bridge was, could he walk across the top of the water when it flooded? But of course, the sun, the whole idea was that the sun would be coming up in the water, and that's the fire, because clay needs fire to set it. And of course, that's not exactly what happens at the end of Bridge of Clay, is that you've got all these ideas and you know where you want to go, and you've got your checkpoints that you want to run through, but you've got to be flexible enough on the way to realise you've been doing all this work. I've been working so hard on all of this, and all of that was to get the idea that's actually over there. And that's from the beginning of the idea to almost the end of the idea. And then the problem was, I always thought, and I'll shut up in a second, the problem was I thought this was my best idea, my most ambitious idea. It was going to supposedly be my best book, and so I couldn't write it. I was never ready to write it. And so book after book after book came by, and then The Book Thief was my 5th book, and then I had nothing else really to write, and I went, it's time to write Bridge of Clay.
Okay, but in the writing of it too, you had a female narrator to begin with. Matthew's the narrator now. So look, working on a book for that long, to suddenly ditch the narrator and pick someone else to be that voice. I find it hard in the writing process to work for days and days and days, even if it's only on the one page or one very small piece of a historical narrative, and then suddenly realize it's not going to work, and having to ditch it, which feels terrible. I mean, how did you feel, with plot changes of narrator, and so on in the writing of the book?
Yeah, well, when I changed the narrator of the book from a girl who lived across the road to Matthew, it was basically only 8 years worked. that disappeared on me. But as you know, and as I think we all know as readers and writers, is that nothing is ever truly lost. And I had this sort of obscene optimism that I could still pull this off, that I could still do it. And it's just funny, when you talk about 13 years, this is one of my favourite stories about Bridge of Clay, is last July I was sitting at the kitchen table and at breakfast, 7 a.m. in the morning, 7 a.m., sorry, at 7 in the morning, and my daughter was sitting opposite me diagonally at the kitchen table, and there she was eating her breakfast. Now, I don't know in India, but what Indian children are like, but Australian children, they eat like barbarians, or at least my children do. And so I was sitting there trying to do last edits of Bridge of Clay. She was diagonally opposite, eating cereal. There's crunching and there's cereal going outside the bowl, and I'm trying to concentrate. And I looked over at her and I said, "Are you okay over there? I'm trying to get a lot of work done here. Got a lot of work to do today." And she looked at me, she's holding her spoon, she looked up, crossed the table, and she just went, "You work?" And I had a really good think about that the whole day. And then I don't normally count words in a book, but on this I thought, let's just see how many words this is. And it turned out to be 120, maybe 128,000 words in Bridge of Clay. And then I thought, now let's divide that by 13 years. And it turned out to be 1.9 words per day. Not even two words a day. And then I thought, yeah, she's got a point. But then she got home from school that afternoon. I didn't tell her about, the whole mathematical thing, but she's heard me say it once or twice now. But now when she's asked, someone says to her, it's something like this. They say, "Oh, do you want to be a writer too?" And she just says, "This is the difference between the home child and the public child." She says, "No, it looks like too much hard work." I think she's been trained really well.
Yeah. Look, one of the characters, or one of the main characters in the book is Penelope Luszczeszko, and who is a refugee who leaves Poland in the early 80s, crying all the way to Vienna after being sneaked out by her father. We're both children of migrants. Mine were Polish, of course. Your parents came from Germany and Austria. And I guess to say that their lives were totally shaped by their experiences, and that those experiences were passed down to us through their storytelling. And I know that was a very big part of your upbringing, as it was of mine. So how has that shaped you as a writer? I mean, it comes out strongly in The Book Thief, of course, because it's set in Nazi Germany. Here you've got a Polish refugee coming to Australia in the early 80s.
Yeah, it's... the first thing I'll say about Penelope Luszczeszko in that book, who becomes Penny Dunbar, and she's also called the mistake maker because she makes a lot of mistakes when she plays the piano as a child, is she's really the heart of the book. Everyone pays attention to the five brothers and how rough they are, but they worship this woman who brought them up, and I think they realise that she's made them who they are, or at least made them the good things that they are. And what I was really interested in, and I think maybe from becoming a parent during the writing of this book, but I was always interested in the idea that books really have more backstories than we think they do. And that was why I went into the backstory of Penelope and Michael Dunbar, the boys, Clay's father, because I really believe that we all are who we are long before we're even born. And so I was really interested in, the Iliad and the Odyssey run through this book because Penny brings those two books with her. It's the first books she has in English, and she brings them to Australia from Poland because her dad would read them to her. And I was just interested then in the idea that everyone has nicknames in the book. Clay is the smiler, Penny's the mistake maker, or the broken-nosed bride because she breaks her nose in a car accident the day before her wedding. And all the boys have nicknames, and I loved how I realised that that's like that in the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's always the fast-running Achilles. It's always the resourceful Odysseus, laughter-loving Aphrodite. And so what I realised, the other things that they had in common was that there was a bigness to things. And we all think that we have dull suburban or urban or country lives. But then we all have, we all fall in love. We all have loneliness. We all have people die on us. And so I realised that I wanted this to be a kind of suburban epic. And so I wanted to recognise the stories that have came before us that also shape who we are. And to me, all of my books have tended to be about a love of words and story. And it's something that Bridge of Clay does have in common with The Book Thief, is just that stories are what make us who we are.
Yeah. No, I think that comes out very strongly. I mean, reading, the second part of the book, which is about Penelope's travels from Poland, her experiences in Australia and so on, I was actually really struck. You have this Polish dialogue in the book, and speaking Polish, reading Polish, I thought, hey, that's pretty good. That's really spot on. I encountered a lot of Polish refugees coming out of Poland in those days, so I could totally identify with her experiences as well. And then I met your wife, who is Polish and came out around about the same time. So again, something that you drew on, you know, those experiences that she would have had as a much younger child coming out.
Yeah, it's funny thinking about that. It just struck me now. I remember I used to say, because I used my own parents' stories in The Book Thief, when people asked me for writing advice, I would say, well, firstly, never let your parents get involved, because there would always be these arguments about what happened and how it worked. And my dad, I got him to edit the German in The Book Thief, and he was doing such a good job on the German that he started thinking it was his right to start editing the English as well. He'd say, well, you know, where the mayor's wife was sitting hunch drunk at the table, he'd say, hunch drunk, that should be punch drunk. And I'd say, you just stick to the German, all right? That's just playing with the language. In this case, I would write and Polish is such a hard language to navigate. And so I would just make stuff up. You know, whenever there was a line, I would just write some gibberish down or something. You know, it would be one of my favourite ones was I knew the word for pasta and for ice cream in Polish. And there was one sentence where Penelope says to herself, "Don't hesitate." My version of "don't hesitate" was pasta, ice cream in Polish. And so I just wrote the words I knew. And I hoped it would work itself out. But there were hour-long arguments at the dinner table about which bit of Polish should be used, which ending should be used. So it's a very complicated language, but it's something that I really loved. But it was also, again, not only the language but the stories. One of the things that I loved was just hearing my parents-in-law's stories about coming to Australia and they'd never seen a cockroach before. And then it became clear to them that the first place they lived in didn't belong to them at all. It belonged to a squadron of cockroaches. And then there were all these houses, and they'd never seen houses made of fibro before. And so they thought all the houses in Australia were made of paper. And that's one of the chapter headings in the book, paper houses. And so it's the little things and those little observations that become so real in a book.
Yeah, I mean, the Book Thief, of course, set in Nazi Germany. This book largely set in the western suburbs of Sydney. So do you feel like you were writing for two different audiences? I mean, one the Book Thief being for obviously an international audience. This one, were you ever thinking how an international readership might relate to that very Australian setting?
Well, it's one of the reasons the book is set in Sydney, but I never mention the name Sydney.
You don't.
But the Opera House turns up, and the Harbour Bridge, and certain other areas if you know Sydney, and it just depends when you work it out. I also don't mention, so Penelope Leszczuk does come from Poland, but it's always referred to as a city in the Eastern Bloc, and the name Warsaw only enters the book with maybe 20 pages to go, and that then just felt right. I'm going so much on feel. And one of the reasons I don't mention Sydney as a city is it's, I guess, breaking the rule. Not in a way that's trying to be rebellious, but breaking the rule that to make something universal, you have to make it very personal. I sometimes think I just call Sydney a city because I want it to be, in some conceivable way, your city, or a part of a city you know. And so I deliberately just stand a little bit back just to make it maybe that little bit more accessible for people to just put themselves into that place without them necessarily even knowing it's Sydney. But if you know Sydney, you can tell.
Yeah. As I said at the beginning of the book, and for those who haven't read it, it is about the Dunbar brothers, and it's narrated by Matthew, who's pounding it out on an old typewriter that he's unearthed in a backyard. Again, location left to the imagination. I actually, when you bring the typewriter in, it also felt quite right. Maybe for two reasons, and tell me if I'm wrong. One, because I knew it had taken so long for you to write the book, and writing a book on a typewriter would be immeasurably slower than trying to do it on a laptop or a PC. But the other thing was that it also just set the pace for the story in a way. So I love that idea.
It was one of the breakthroughs of the book. There was always, when Maggie, the first narrator, was telling this story, she was sitting up on the roof of the Dunbar house, which is where Clay often sits. And then when Matthew took over, he was sitting on the roof. And I quit this book twice. And the first time was when I was just running out of time again. That was at about the 9-year mark. And one of the big differences was that I quit the book, I went surfing, and then I came back and I was reading a book by Lars Sabai Christensen, who's one of my favourite writers, a Norwegian writer. And then I thought, God, I love his books, but I thought if he can do it, God damn it, I can do it. You know, I can finish this. And so I started again. And what I decided to do was, instead of have Matthew sitting on the roof outside, I brought him into the kitchen. And the kitchen is my favourite room in the house. It's because it has there's so much going on in the kitchen all the time. It's a place of activity. It's why I love the story of my daughter saying, you know, what she said, because I think the kitchen is where there's a lot of truth. It's also when you're a kid, I mean, a kid growing up in Sydney at the time I grew up, you know, it was where you got in trouble, and because it's so close to the wooden spoons. And so we had all of that that going on as well. So once I had Matthew come inside the kitchen, he was inside the story. He was in the heart of the book, because so many big things happen in that kitchen. It's where their dad comes home for the first time. It's where their mum tells them she's going to die. It's where then all sorts of things happen, you know, and then Clay tells the story to Matthew in the kitchen. And then I just started writing, and then Matthew did one thing. And when I say Matthew, it's because this is what you're waiting for, is when the moment you cross over from being you to being the character. And Matthew said, I went out to an old backyard in an old backyard of a town and to get this typewriter. And as soon as I wrote old backyard in an old backyard of a town, I recognised that I'd done a whole lot of work, and at that moment I was playing. I was just playing. And that's, to me, what writing is. It's like climbing a mountain, but there's the promise of a sandpit at the top. And then you just get to play, but you don't get to play without doing the work. And so at that moment, I became Matthew, and by the end of the book, and it's funny, this is the first time I've ever written a book where I've read through it with people before it was published, and just because I think it took so long, and I wanted to be sure. And at the end, I was very emotional reading the last 50 pages of this book, and a good friend of mine and colleague said, you know, why are you so emotional? Like, who are you crying for in your own life as you read that? And I just looked at her and I said, you know, I didn't say, don't you get it? But that's how I felt. I just said, it's for them. It's like, these people are real to me. When I'm reading it, I'm in it. I'm there. I am Matthew, and I am Penelope. I'm all those people, and I'm feeling like this for them, because they're me and I'm them. And so that's what I'm always looking for when I'm writing, is that moment where I wrote this book and The Book Thief for all of you out there, but I also wrote them for Liesl and for Clay, because they're as real to me when I'm writing it. You've got to write the book for the characters inside the book.
They become an intrinsic part of your life. They do. I've written 2 biographies, and people ask me about the process of writing biography, and I always say, if you don't start living, empathizing, living, almost sympathizing with that character, feeling part of their life, almost feeling responsible for them in a way, then forget it. You start all over again, pick another topic. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's what I have two pieces of advice when people ask me about what it takes to be a writer or any advice for writing. And often I'll tell people to take it easy on yourself when you're having a bad day, that you're not terrible, you're not hopeless, you're not, you can do it. But at the same time, you've got to cultivate that kind of iron will. You're going to turn up the next day, and you will, if you really want it.
Tell us a little bit more about that writing process. I know that if I'm not happy with how I think the book ought to begin, I can't keep going. Did you start with page one and then get to the last page? Did you have that clearly in your mind how the book would start, or did that come later?
Yeah, I pretty much write from beginning to end, and one of the problems with Bridge of Clay was that I got too bogged down on page one. Mm-hmm. I wrote the first 200 pages of The Book Thief, the very first manuscript, in a month, and it felt like it took about 2 years to write the first page of Bridge of Clay, and that was my first mistake. And I just got too much into the mechanics of the words, but then finally I wrote other pieces. I would force myself to go back to Penelope's story or Michael Dunbar's story and just write that. And then I'd read over that and I'd go, God, there's actually some air in this. There's actually, and that's what you want. I mean, it should be hard work. And I think it is the sort of book that does demand something of the reader, that you do need to pay attention. But a book should feel like it was hard work, but not feel not appear that way. And so that's what when I took a break from just that first page and writing more of the story, it started to open up for me.
Yeah. Tell us a bit more about some of the writers that have influenced your work. Has that changed over the years as well?
I think that's the sort of thing that's always evolving, and I think every book you take on a new hero, and I think obviously I got a new appreciation for Homer writing Bridge of Clay, but also John Irving as well, so The World According to Garp and A Prayer for Owen Meany and books like that, because to me they were books that took their time, and they were books that were written for readers, not necessarily for people who are just casual bystanders. I think you need to invest something of yourself in those books, and they make a whole world. I like the idea, fantasy. There's the idea that all fantasy novels have a world that's built in them, but every novel builds a world, and that's what I felt John Irving did in his book. So he was a big influence this time around. But when I was a kid, when I was 14, 15, we were on a diet of American literature, and so things like S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders and Rumblefish, they were the sort of books that made me think that maybe I could do it. They were almost like the musical version of punk, because you thought these are very straightforward. They don't use incredible words. They're just books that tell stories. And then I was always influenced then by writers who made you want to see things, see visions. And so I even loved W.P. Kinsella, who wrote Shoeless Joe, because and a lot of short stories, because he writes in such a vivid way that you're experiencing the world in a totally unique way that also feels somehow eerily, beautifully familiar. And I realised that that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give you something that you've never seen or felt before, but you also kind of recognise it.
Do you also identify with writers such as, say, Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, and then, until this latest book was published, we thought she hadn't written anything again, or even Arundhati Roy, whose runaway success, The God of Small Things, was followed up by a very, very long gap. She wrote, of course, a lot of non-fiction, but it was only, a year ago that do you identify with those writers who've had that sort of runaway success and have that incredible pressure on them to produce something else, produce something that's going to be just as successful?
Yeah, well, the longer it went on, I did, and it was funny that one of my favourite writers is Michael Chabon, and his great book Wonder Boys. Everyone knows The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, but Wonder Boys is the book of his that I revisit more, and that's about a writer in deep trouble for all sorts of reasons. But he'd written a book that had been a big success, and the character in the book, Grady Tripp, had written a book that had been very successful, and then he couldn't follow it up. He couldn't write. He had written 2,611 pages or something of this new book, but he couldn't finish it. And I used to read that, and then I'd even watch the film, and the film's really good. And I'd always look at it, and I'd go, well, at least I'm not in as much trouble as him. And then there was a tipping point where I went over to the other side, where I went, actually, I'm in more trouble than him. And so, but you know, the real unsung hero of Bridge of Clay in that respect was my wife, who sat me down in the kitchen, of course, and said, it's been 10 years that you've been working on this book. I'm giving you 1 week. Giving you 1 week. And it wasn't to finish the book, it was to be happy again writing it. And I don't want to give you the idea that I was in this tortured state. I wasn't. I've got a really good life, and I've got a great family, great kids, animals that drive me crazy, and all of those things. But the book, I think the feeling of failure, I always loved the book, and I loved the joy and the struggle of writing the book. But she said, this is it. You know, it's enough is enough. And that week came and went just like all the others, and I had to stop writing it for about 6 weeks. And with nothing else on the horizon, and I started writing these other little side projects that I had in mind, and they just felt empty. They felt empty because when I realised that what Bridge of Clay was my proving of myself to myself. And the Bridge of Clay was like, writing Bridge of Clay was like writing for the World Championship of myself. You know, that this was it. This was the big one. And when I realised that that's what it was, I thought, now I'm ready. I'm ready to go in. I'm ready to just get my hands dirty and not work so hard at working hard. Just get in there, work hard, get your hands dirty, love the struggle, and be willing to do the dirty work, you know. And so, and then all these little things started popping up, and this is where, you'll have to forgive me for this story, but equal to my daughter has a story, and now I'm going to give you my son's story in this book. And that was all these little things. When I just went in to go, now I'm going to love it again. I'm just going to love what I do. All these little memories started popping up. And what I remembered was being on holiday with the family about 3 hours from Sydney, really hot day. And I don't know why I did this, because I never do it ordinarily. But two things. Firstly, I washed my car, which I don't normally, I do about once every 5 years. And my car has got dog hair, sand, kids' lolly wrappers and things in it. And so I usually just leave it. But I decided to clean the car. And I took my T-shirt off because it was hot, and I just brushed some sand out of the car, okay? And my son came around the corner. He was 4 years old. And he looked at me without my T-shirt on. Now, there's always a story before the story or inside the story. Now, my kids don't call me Dad. They call me Pop. And they call me Pop because of the books. And I mentioned it in India, so I think there were these books, the Berenstain Bears. And in those books, there's the son and there's the dad. And the dad, he calls Pop. And, of course, Pop is a real idiot. And so when I read that with my kids, the first thing they did was they started calling me Pop. And so I was brushing the sand out of the car without my T-shirt on, and my son came around the corner and he saw me and he stopped in his tracks and he went, "Hey, Pop, what are you doing here in just your nipples?" And I stopped just dead in my tracks, And I looked at him. I can't even remember what I said anymore. And I looked at him and I said, or I look back now and I just think, that's just genius, you know? And only a 4-year-old can come up with that. And of course, the second thing I thought was, I might be able to use that. And of course, when I got back into the book, so to come back to the question, the heart of the book, or there are many hearts in the book, but there's a chapter called Growing Up the Dunbar Way. And in that chapter, that moment when my son said to me, what are you doing here in Just Your Nipples, is exactly what Tommy Dunbar, the youngest Dunbar boy, says to their dad when they all, because they're spilling so much, so you can see how things are intertwining. They're all spilling so much food on their clothes when they eat that I absolutely love that. That they make the kids eat their dinner without their shirts, all right? And their dad does it as well. And that's when Tommy says, what are you doing here in Just Your Nipples? And so what I realised is taking a week off, or taking 6 weeks off from the book, was how much I missed it, how much I love it, and just how much it means to me. And there's the Australian playwright, David Williamson, who's probably one of Australia's most loved. He talks about it in one of his interviews, where he said, you hear all these writers talk about every word is like a drop of blood on the page. And he just said, bullshit. You do it because you love it. And once I sort of regained that thought and remembered it, that's when the whole book opened up for me again.
Look, that comes through in every page, just how much you love that book. And you are a masterful storyteller on paper and in person, as I think we experienced here today. But look, we've got about 15 or 20 minutes left, so I'll throw it open to the audience, and I can see almost as many hands coming up as came up when I asked how many of you had a copy of Markus's book. So I'm meant to choose from all of you, I guess, yes? The lady in the yellow, yes, please, okay. We'll do it sort of democratically as we can, please.
If you shout it, we can repeat it. It's not working.
Hello. Hi.
Hey.
There are still 100 pages to go till I complete the Bridge of Clay, but one character that is the heart for me for Bridge of Clay is Carrie, and we did not talk about her. So could you just tell us where did the inspiration come from, and did she have to necessarily go? Like what you did to her, did that have to happen? And also I recommend The Book Thief to every friend. So.
Thank you. And I'm sorry that you have to do that. And with the reactions you might get. Okay, so there is a girl called Carrie in Bridge of Clay. She's an apprentice jockey. She's Clay's best friend and the love of his life. And you know, the first thing I'll say is a lot of this book, a lot of Bridge of Clay, we didn't mention that the Dunbar boys also have 5 animals. They have a dog, a border collie called Rosie. They have a goldfish called Agamemnon, a cat called Hector, a pigeon called Telemachus, and a mule named Achilles. And the whole, I'm going to tell the whole book. Okay, the whole book is written around Clay, but much of the book is also written around Achilles, the mule. And that's why they live in a racing district, and that in a horse racing sector of the city. And that was why that enabled me to bring all the horse racing into the book and Carrie into the book as a character. Now, you talk about the tragedy of Carrie. What every story needs is one last big hurdle for the protagonist to leap over. And Carrie for Clay, unfortunately for him, is that hurdle. And so, you know, I don't want to give any spoilers, and there was something else which I can just say quickly directly to you is when the boys take their mum and dad's bed over into the field and they want to burn it and they don't burn it, this all relates back to how Carrie gives Clay the lighter, the Zippo lighter, which she jokingly says, this is for your bridge, because a bridge needs fire, a bridge of clay needs fire to set it. And that all came back to be the perfect, moment of, I won't say exactly what, but you know what I mean. It made the perfect moment that would test Clay for the last time. And but thank you for bringing her up.
Okay,
I'll be quicker.
okay. We'll go to the young girl in the denim jacket, and then you, sir, in the pink T-shirt behind her.
I can't stand it. Is it okay? Yeah. I know you get this a lot probably, but like I really want to know, why did you write The Book Thief?
Why did I write The Book Thief? I guess there are a couple of reasons, and I want to give you the exact reason without making something up. So I'll probably fall around a bit, but it's in a way, The Book Thief is about it's about where I'm from. And when I say that, obviously I wasn't in Nazi Germany. My mum and dad grew up there. But it's about, why I wrote The Book Thief is this. So now it usually takes a bit of a warm-up. All right, now I've got it. I wrote The Book Thief because I grew up in Sydney, where you play cricket in the backyard, where you imagine decimating your Indian heroes. Your brother is Kapil Dev coming into bowl, and you're Alan Border trying to bat, all right? But we came inside sweating, and when our mum and dad told their stories, it was like a piece of Europe came into our house. And I think without understanding or thinking about that, I understood that was the power of storytelling. And I think that's why I wrote The Book Thief, because in so many ways, I'm still that kid sitting in that kitchen, hearing that story for the first time, and realising now that that's what taught me to be a writer.
The gentleman in the pink T-shirt, and then we'll go get some questions from the back. So quick question, please.
Hi. So, authors like you and Anthony Doan, the movie Schindler's List, they bring a lot of new emotions to the Nazi Germany era, like kindness and love and affection, as compared to the horror that's attached to it. So, do you believe that you have managed to attach some new emotions besides the horror with your books and some other works of literature?
Okay, I couldn't quite catch everything in that, but I think what The Book Thief is about is, it took me a very long time to understand. Everyone says you've got to have a quick elevator pitch of what your book is about, and I never knew. And then one time I was actually standing in an elevator, and someone said, "What's your book about?" I went, "This is literally the elevator pitch." But The Book Thief is about the fact that in Nazi Germany, Hitler destroyed people with words, and The Book Thief is about a girl who was stealing the words back and writing her own story with it, and it's a beautiful story, hopefully, in that ugly world. And I think, like I said, I couldn't quite catch everything in the question, but I think this is why it's a well that will never run dry that time, because I think everything's on the line. There's so much at stake because of the history that surrounds that book. And I think that's why you've got to be, hopefully very respectful to it in the writing of it. And I think, and you're bringing those opposites together. Sorry, you're bringing the opposites together to show the true terror and the true beauty.
Okay, there's a gentleman almost at the very back in an olive shirt. Okay, someone else in the meantime. Okay, we've got to go. The lady here, also in an olive thing. Thank you.
What did you think of the movie adaptation of The Book Thief? Did you think it adequately represented your work?
There's the old adage, you should never ask the writer what they thought of the movie. Mainly because, firstly, writers will complain about everything, but that's nothing compared to how much they complain about the movie based on their book. So, I just think I followed my vision completely writing that book, and the film followed its own vision. And I don't think I didn't want to get in the way of that. And so were there things that I would have done differently? Yes. Were there things that I thought were beautiful? Yes. I think the big difference is that the film and the book have two very different audiences. And I think the film audience is much younger. They really wanted children to see that film as a kind of introduction to that topic and that time, which wasn't my purpose. So you can already see two different purposes. So in the end, it doesn't necessarily matter. And the film certainly brought a whole new audience to the book. And that's one thing that a writer will still complain about, but not as much.
Okay, have we got a mic at the back? There was a gentleman. No, he's. I think he was probably going to ask the same question. There is, just so we can be a bit democratic, and there's a lady there in yellow right under the camera. Can we get a mic to her? Yeah. And then I'll take some questions from this side. Thank you.
Hi, Markus.
Hi.
My question's about the 5 animals. You just listed their names. Why were they named like that? I mean, there are a lot of characters from the Odyssey, but why did you choose those particular names?
Those particular ones? Well, this is always one of the favourite writing questions, is when there should be a deeper meaning, but there isn't. Well, in this case, I mean, you can't go past Achilles. That's like Achilles picks himself. Odysseus picks himself. And then Agamemnon, to me, was just always the most outrageous name for a pet. And so I went Agamemnon. And then the interesting one was Hector, the cat. It wasn't always Hector, it was something else. I think it was Apollo. And then there was another cat called Cyclops, but I cut Cyclops out of the book. And then Telemachus was Odysseus' son, and we could shorten it to T. They just needed, they served a purpose. They just needed to be hard enough for everyone to despise Tommy for naming them that way, but also to understand that it was in homage to their mother. And that was why I gave them those particular names. Good question.
Okay, I'll take some questions from this side. Where are the mics? Okay, so I think there are two ladies there with their hands up right next to each other. You'll have to fight over the mic.
Hi.
Okay. Oops.
So at one point in the book Thief, Liesel sneaks a book out of the burning heap. If you were in place of Liesel, which book would you sneak out of it?
These are killers, these questions. Okay, if I had to pull a book out of the burning heap. Okay, this is what we're going to do. There's another question. I'll think about it while I'm answering the other question. Okay, let's see. One we didn't pick today, and I know I'm going to be furious at myself. Let me see. Okay, I'm going to go for one that I always mention as a favourite book, because it would be a desert island book for me. I'm going to say What's Eating Gilbert Grape, because it shows that great characters make great books.
Okay, great. We'll go with the lady at the front here in the stripy top.
Hello, Markus. As it was mentioned earlier, I want to ask about how it was as a male to write from a female's perspective, as you started the book with a female narrator. So what was it like, and what made you shift to a male narrator again? Thank you.
Thank you. It's funny because I never doubt. Actually, the reason I went away from Maggie, the female narrator, was not because she was a girl. I felt like I really had her voice, and she was the sort of girl. She had lived a lot in the house with the Dunbar boys, and so one of the big lines, and one of the lines I was very attached to in the book was, "My name is Maggie Novak. I'm a girl, but I'm a Dunbar boy." And I loved that line. And I couldn't, and it was one of the hard things to let go of. And so, but it, I'll tell you the absolute truth was this. She was Carey Novak's younger sister, and she was also in love with Clay. And then it was going down this way where then something would happen, and she was pining for Clay at the end of the book, and I couldn't do that to Carey. And that was why I went away from Maggie as the narrator of the book. It had, and I liked her voice a lot. And the good thing is, it was a failed attempt at this book, but it might be in another book one day.
You really care about your characters. It's a very lovely thing to have. All right. Why don't we get a gentleman, because we've had lots of ladies. There's a gentleman here with a lovely scarf in just near the aisle.
Actually, the question is for my friend. He was raising hands.
First of all, Satvik,
I love the
you.
opportunity.
I'm breaking up with my girlfriend for you. Okay, my question, first of all, Marcus, thank you for the book Thief. On 31st January 2011, my birthday, I was gifted the book Thief, and that started my love for historical fiction, historical literature, specifically centered around World War II. Now, my question is with regards to when you're building a world in, say, Nazi Germany. It's a place where you've never lived. It's so far away. How do you create the structures? How do you create the physical environment and remember what you have built so that there are no continuity errors? So the mayor's house, the one house where only the picture of Hitler was standing after the earthquake. Then there's the school, there's the woods, and there's Liesel's own house. How do you remember all the structures you have created and keep them continuous throughout the book?
Okay. It's purely because you're always there. It's a little bit like when we were kids, and I still remember it's the same reason I can still remember my mum and dad's phone number off by heart, is because I lived in that world and I spent so much time there. You know, you spend all these hours every day either working on these books or thinking about them. So I'm always in that world. There are two worlds for me. And so you can imagine when you're a writer, what you want is to be able to wake up in the morning and look to your left or your right, whichever it is, and feel like you could just roll out of bed into the world that you're writing. But sometimes that world is 10 miles away and you have to run there, and then you forgot the key, so you got to beat the door down. But what you want is to be familiar with that world. Now, I do it a couple of different ways. I basically write chapter headings down in my book, in my notebooks, over and over and over again. I could recite to you the 88 chapters of the Book Thief titles. I could recite to you the 100 chapters in Bridge of Clay. And when I write those headings out, I'm seeing what happens in those chapters, and I'm seeing the places. And so I'm seeing Frau Holzapfel's house, and I'm seeing Liesel's house. I'm seeing the mayor's wife's library. It's all there. And so because I spend so much time there, it's just doing the work. That's how you remember. And you will make mistakes, but then you do edits, and then you read the book, and then you've read part 1 150 times. That's how you know. It's doing the work and being there. And I'm sure you concur.
Yeah,
with that.
absolutely. Yes. We've got time for one more question. Oh, this is really hard. What about the lady here at the front who's had to endure sitting on the floor?
I'm happy to do one more after this, and I'll cut the time in half.
Okay.
Thank you so much for Book Thief. It's the best book, I would say. And my question is related to it. What was that one moment or that one book or that conversation or a teacher who made you fall in love with words and share it with the world?
I never had a teacher tell me, Marcus, you're going to be a writer one day. Never. I never won a writing competition. I never won anything. I think it was an accumulation of moments. It wasn't one. And it was just reading novels and you know that moment, you know when you're reading a book and you feel like you're there, you don't notice the pages turning anymore, and you know it's not true, but you believe it when you're in it. That's what made me say, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And so it was an accumulation of moments rather than one moment in particular.
One more question. Marcus, why don't you choose who it's going to be?
Okay. I'm going to go for the absolute underdog. So the furthest one back, you're in a green sort of jacket. Sorry, everyone else.
Good afternoon. I first want to say, Mr. Marcus, you've influenced me really deeply, and I love what you do. You've helped me become a writer. And my question is, what is the most fulfilling thing about being a writer?
Sorry, the most...
The most fulfilling thing about being a writer.
Okay. There's a joke answer which is finishing. But the real answer is that moment that I said when you realise you're in the sandpit. It's when you got up in the morning, you didn't feel like writing, you have no confidence, no real reason to live. I mean, I'm joking, of course, but you don't feel like you're really worth anything as a writer, and then you sit down, you do the work, and you write a sentence, and you think, God, I didn't know I was going to... And it's not that you're thinking you're great or you're whatever, but you're surprised by something that you wrote. So that's what I would say. It's when you're surprised and you think, God, I didn't know I was going to write that today. And it's those little moments of beauty that happen. They're the most fulfilling moments as a writer. And lastly, it's moments like this when you meet readers and other writers and people who still love books. And that makes you still have, a huge belief, not only in readers of the world, but people of the world. So thanks so much to all of you. I'm going to ask one favour from the audience. I hope this won't take long. One favour from the audience is I'd really love to dedicate this session in line with what I just said. A good book-selling friend of a community at home in Australia in a place called Ulladulla, Gary Evans, who was a great reader, a great lover of books, a publisher, died quite suddenly and over the last few months was quite sick, but he was a huge and fierce lover of books, writers and readers, and I dedicate this session to him. I'm all the way in India, but I'd like, if you could applaud him for his efforts as a lover of books would be great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
We'd just like to say thank you so much to our panellists here, Markus and John. Another round of applause. Thank you to the Australian High Commission for sponsoring this wonderful session. So thank you, our author and our wonderful moderator.